Hello and welcome to a conversation with Milind Deora. He's, of course, he's been a former union minister in the Manmohan Singh cabinet. He's a Congress leader from South Mumbai. And welcome, Milind. How has COVID been treating you? I can see you've grown a beard. I think is this all part of something to do during lockdown?
I've been sort of going back and forth between a beard and being clean shaven, but that's just more of a fashion statement rather than linked to COVID. But things with COVID have been, in Mumbai specifically, where I've been spending most of my time, have been extremely challenging. I think Mumbai and Delhi, of course, have been the worst hit. And for no fault of both the city and city states or the governments, it's just that these are two of the most important cities in the country. And there's people that flow into these cities from different parts of the country. They have the largest airports, the largest rail networks which connect into here, the largest populations of migrants from all parts of India. So it's bound to be a hotbed for COVID. But in that sense, I think Mumbai is certainly getting better. Mumbai is a little better than Delhi is right now. But again, with COVID, these numbers, which city is better today may not be the same tomorrow. Which country is better today may not be the same tomorrow. India was not looking good at all 3 months ago. But today, when I think about Europe, which is undergoing a massive and very stringent lockdown, in some ways, India having an aggressive lockdown earlier on, a gradual reopening, may well be we may be better off than, let's say, America or Europe. So nobody is going to win the battle against COVID in the short run. I think until such time as this pandemic is behind us and we experience 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 waves like the Spanish flu did a century ago, it'll be impossible to judge which city or which country has done well. But Mumbai is coping, and I think we're on a path of maintaining a degree of stabilization in the city.
In fact, before we go into the other topic, Milind, you spoke of a lockdown. In fact, I'm told that even now people are mulling a lockdown, though, of course, the Prime Minister and I think most chief ministers are against it. Where do you stand on the lockdown? Because you are at a place where corporate, India is also, so we've heard that it's been very bad for the economy, but there is always that balance to be walked. So where do you stand on it?
So look, I think that a lockdown in every country, in every city, in every state was certainly essential in the early part of the coronavirus pandemic and the outbreak. And it was essential really to, make people aware that there is a pandemic, they need to be careful, what are the protocols they need to follow. And more importantly, to upgrade the country, the cities, the states' healthcare system to be able to provide for ventilators in the case of severe patients, ICU beds, and in the case of mild to moderate patients, perhaps oxygen, oximeters, and create quarantine facilities in large cities like Mumbai or even in a large American city like New York, for example. So in that sense, aggressive lockdown in the beginning, in my opinion, was essential. And I think every country did that in the right way. Some countries it worked well, some didn't. Some countries people followed it. In other countries, they didn't. And in some countries and some cities and some states, in a period of 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks of the initial aggressive lockdown, the administration and the infrastructure of that region were able to quickly upgrade their healthcare systems. Some others weren't. But that certainly had a huge impact on the economy and affected livelihoods. So I firmly believe that today there's absolutely no need for a lockdown of the kind that India, Mumbai, other parts of the world have seen. I would not agree to a European-style lockdown, but Europe has very, very high and very stringent standards when it comes to all kinds of issues, especially healthcare, genetically modified foods, climate change, even, for example, digital privacy. Europeans are unique in that sense, and they adhere to very, very high standards. So I understand where they're coming from, but I think that in a country like ours, I do not believe that we can afford another lockdown of the kind we had. I think some degree of, for example, let's say cases spiral out of control in Delhi. If the government were to say, we have a curfew where a restaurant or places have to shut after, 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Those kinds of things are okay to reduce community transmission.
So you mean restricted movements or
I think
controlled
restricted
environment?
movements. For example, in Mumbai, which the lifeline of Mumbai city is its rail network, right? It's suburban rail network, and so how do you phase out an opening on the suburban rail network, which ultimately impacts how do you reopen commercial spaces, offices, retail spaces? Those are areas which governments and administrations nationally, regionally, even locally can tweak. But having a blanket lockdown where you're asked to stay in your home and not go out, I don't think any government in India would want to do that. And I don't think it would be prudent. I think it would be a complete disaster.
For that. Then how do you see the economy picking up, Milind? What has been we've seen the impact on the economy. How do we get it started again in a COVID continuous era, not even a post-COVID? We're not even there yet.
So I think that, look, the fact is that the first quarter was devastating for the Indian economy. I do believe that the lockdown was not planned as effectively as it should have been. There certainly should have been more coordination, cooperation with state governments having more cooperation perhaps with local municipalities, especially in large cities. And that had a huge toll on our first quarter. I think the second quarter is also going to be problematic, but the second quarter has certainly shown signs of a recovery. I do believe that going forward, the economy will pick up. I do believe that the Indian economy will rebound. I do believe that the fundamentals of the Indian economy remain very strong. But there are certain sectors which I don't know if they will come back and how soon they'll come back. So, for example, live entertainment, let's say a movie theater, a theme park, a restaurant in the hospitality space, a hotel. So hotels, for instance, their occupancy for a restaurant, for F&B is increasing. But their revenue for banquets, which means like weddings, is still very, very low because there are a lot of government restrictions. Their revenue and bookings for rooms is extremely low still. Also because there are very limited tourists from abroad and people moving between city to city. So those are industries which will take a long time to recover. But there are again industries which you would think which would be very, very adversely affected by COVID, which in some ways are doing better. So today, real estate, for instance, is showing signs of very quick recovery. And that's encouraging because real estate is a very big driver of economic growth in our country. Real estate, mind you, impacts construction, obviously, and construction impacts cement. It impacts sectors like steel. And it has a huge impact on even on state revenues. State governments earn thousands of crores of rupees from stamp duty. So real estate coming back, people choosing to buy homes and feeling that now is the time to invest in a home. And COVID taught them that it's important to have, if there's one asset we need to invest in, if we have disposable income, it's a home. That's a sector which, again, anyone you talk to, from low-income housing developers, medium-income housing to high-income housing developers, all are showing signs of recovery and some encouraging trends. But overall, I do believe, as I said, the economy will improve. There are certain sectors which, now again, real estate is primarily residential real estate. Commercial real estate is still very badly hit. Retail real estate is, of course, very, very badly hit. But I do believe that we have to start thinking about reimagining the economy. And I think one interesting trend that we can follow is that 100 years ago, when you had the Spanish flu, it coincided with the end of World War I. So just as World War I was ending, in fact, the Spanish flu pandemic began. And it's thanks to World War I and troops being positioned around the world that Spanish flu spread. But it went through 4 phases, and then suddenly 2 years later, it just disappeared. There was no vaccine. And right after the Spanish flu and the end of World War I, you had what was called the Roaring '20s in America, which was really a decade of exuberance. You had a decade of high economic growth, high investment, high capex investment, a great culture being born. You had the birth of essentially the birth and the spread of jazz music. People were going out more. People were celebrating the end of a pandemic, celebrating the end of World War I. And sure, it lasted just a decade. And then by 1929, you had the Great Depression. And then, of course, that went into a decade later. And then you had World War II. So I think that the world, after what it's seen, and let's say the vaccine starts to get deployed around the world by Q1 2021, And I think by this time next year, hopefully most countries, especially the developing and developed countries, and hopefully countries like India, which can afford to pay for a vaccine, will have vaccinated even their younger population, because they will be very low on the priority list. And by that time, if countries like India and the United States and Europe and China and many other parts of the world have vaccinated their population and COVID is behind them, I don't know if you'll have roaring 20s all over again a century later, but you could have some degree of exuberance in the economy. And I think that could be exciting and interesting. And so I think it's important for people not to be delusional about what will happen with the economy, but I think it's important for people to be optimistic. And I'm certainly optimistic about the Indian economy and the global economy going forward. I certainly believe that we will have to reimagine the economy, and not just the global economy, even the Indian economy. What will it mean in terms of commercial spaces? How often will people commute to offices? How often will you and I be able, we do interviews where you have to physically, I have to meet you physically and in person. We have to bring your camera crew, maybe an OB van to do a interview. Why can't we just do it on Zoom? Now, that also has an economic impact. It impacts, for example, the aviation sector. Priya Saigal won't be taking a flight to come to Mumbai, for instance. It'll affect perhaps your cameraman and his employment. So these are things where we'll have to relook at that, because what a pandemic of this nature does is it kind of philosophically and almost existentially reminds people and policymakers and individuals about what is a priority. And I think in India, a sector which was seldom an election issue, which is healthcare, for instance. You never hear of healthcare being a political issue in an election. It's usually around social issues. Very seldom is it about economic and developmental issues, and certainly not about social sector issues like education, healthcare. And I think today the social sector in India is an important election issue. Today we've been politicking for the last 8 months over COVID, and which state is doing better and which city is doing better and which city has better ICU facilities, and that's good. That's good politics. It's good to have politics over healthcare, and as a result of which, every state government and the nation as a whole and the private sector have upgraded their healthcare capabilities, and it's happened around the world significantly. And I can tell you that about the Mumbai municipality, for instance, where healthcare was never an electoral issue at the local level. And today, I'm not saying Mumbai or the BMC is prepared to fight, the Mumbai Mahanagarpalika is prepared to fight another pandemic, God forbid, if one ever happens again. But it certainly has upgraded its capacity, and and even education now. Parents are concerned about their children's education. How long can you continue to do your education online? And for certain people who don't have smartphones, it's very, very hard for them to do that, especially in large cities. So these are the ways you have to think of politics also. Politics, in a sense, is also being reimagined, if you will. And similarly, the economy will be reimagined. And I think countries and businesses and political parties that are ahead of the curve, that can see beyond and pick up the trends earlier on, will be the ones that succeed ultimately, and the ones who also have the ability to make changes. Just having a vision is not enough. Do you have the ability to modify and change course? Those are also as important.
You said healthcare, before I go on to the topic where I actually lured you here is to talk about the rise of centrist politics. Just one quick question on the COVID management is, now everybody's looking at how to disperse vaccines. Forget which vaccine and when we get it. But when we get it, some people are talking that maybe the Aadhaar, could be one way of getting Aadhaar card to find out which beneficiaries to reach. Have you given that a thought, or if that, as in terms of vaccine disbursement, how should we do that?
So I think the way the world is looking at it is that countries that have data or again, when I say countries, it could be the federal government of those countries, it could be state governments, it could be municipalities, but countries that have data about people with comorbidities would certainly, in their priority list, everyone would obviously prioritize frontline workers over everybody else, and there's no debate about that. But should your next in line be people, regardless of age, who have comorbidities and underlying health conditions, or should it just be a blanket, distribution based on age. So countries which have limited data, what they are doing is they are saying, number one, frontline workers have priority access to a vaccine. Number two, just people based on their age. If you're an elderly citizen, regardless of whether you have underlying health conditions or not, you will get access to a vaccine. I don't know if that's a good strategy. But again, with limited data, there's not much you can do. It's very hard to know whether a younger person at the age of 35, for instance, has very severe diabetes and therefore is also, mind you, a productive asset. So if you are able to identify that young person at the age of 35 is highly diabetic but is working, it's certainly for an economy, for a nation, from a healthcare point of view, from an economic point of view, smarter to target and vaccinate that person before you vaccinate somebody, let's say, who's in their 70s. And I don't mean to be discriminatory in any way against the elderly, but that's the smarter way to go about a vaccination process.
But focus on those who can stay at home should be second.
Those who can stay at home, who are not traveling, who can work productive from home assets to a country. I mean, it's not a discriminatory term when we say human resources. These are not discriminatory terms, but somebody who is a productive asset certainly should get a preference over those who are not. And in this case, it's very likely that you may find people in their 30s, 40s, 20s who have very severe comorbidities, and they should be prioritized. But again, it's very tough to get that data. So can Aadhaar help with that data? Perhaps, but in a country like India, a lot of people are not even diagnosed with comorbidities. People living, for instance, in villages and far-flung areas of the country don't even know they have COVID. I mean, I know of many cases where people may not even have tested positive for COVID. They may have just been asymptomatic. It may have come and gone, and suddenly they die of a heart attack. So in India, it will be very tough to do that. So I think in India, you may have to just have a blanket policy which says frontline workers, number one, and maybe some other kinds of government staff and others who have to go to work. And then perhaps you just do it based on age. And that's how you do it. And so what could happen as a result of that is somebody who's in their 30s or 40s and has comorbidities and is technically at a higher risk than, let's say, a 70-year-old person with no comorbidities or an 80-year-old person will unfortunately have to wait in line and maybe even for a year before he or she gets vaccinated.
Yeah, that is something that I think is going to be the next big challenge before any government. Moving on to that, Milind, I remember, I read your article recently where you wrote about the rise of centrist politics and, we talked about Biden's win. Now, is Biden's win an aberration, or do you think that it is a trend of, politics globally, really? How do you see that?
I hope it's a trend. I hope that a Biden win is a trend, but I think it was not an accident. It was a very carefully designed strategy by the Democrats. I think the Democrats understood that America is a very polarized and divided society. And as is the politics of, around the world. In India also, people, they love Prime Minister Modi, or they absolutely detest his policies and blindly oppose his policies. And that's just the nature of how politics is today around the world. It's become highly polarized and highly divided. And I think the Democrats understood that very well. And therefore, what the Democrats very smartly did was they prevented extreme elements from their party from getting the ticket to start with. And Biden himself picked Kamala Harris, who essentially you could argue is more towards the center-left Democrat. He didn't pick a far-left Democrat as his running. And so what they did was they were able to reach out to swing voters who, if you had a far-left ticket, would perhaps have, abstained or maybe even seen Trump as a preferred candidate. So I think that it's not an accident. It's something that a political party, to script a path to victory, has to very actively do. And I think that as my article's basic thesis was that as politics becomes more and more divided, and bases get cemented. So essentially, in America's example, for instance, the far left were in any case going to vote for a Democrat ticket, regardless of whether it was Biden or a far left candidate, or even if they had a center right candidate, they would have still voted for that ticket. But what was important is to top it up with swing voters who otherwise wouldn't vote for a far left candidate. So I have this analogy, and I think of it as, if you're staring at a clock, 12 o'clock is the center, and 9 o'clock is the far left, and 3 o'clock is the far right. And when politics is become about either you're around 9 to 10 p.m. or you're between 2 to 3 p.m., the entire space of 10 p.m. to 2 p.m., which is essentially 4 hours, is up for grabs. So when a politician comes in and is around 11 p.m. Or 11 o'clock or around 1 o'clock, they're able to actually reach out to the other side. And I think Biden was an 11 o'clock candidate in that sense. So he was able to get 1 o'clock voters as well as 9 o'clock voters on his side. And that's why he could win.
And it's, if there is a larger message really on it also. And you talked, because so far we've been saying it's more like a polarizing vote that kind of holds the day. Suddenly you have a centrist leader, or, centrist also doesn't mean that you're a fence sitter, but someone, I think, as you argued in your article, who can bring diverse opinions together. And that really is the need of the hour. So is this a trend that we hope to see in other parts of the world also?
So as I said, I don't think it's a trend we hope we should see. I think the trend we'll see, Priya, is more polarization, more divisions. You'll see more people, the far left hardening their stand, consolidating, the far right consolidating. But I think the transformative leaders of the future will be people who can be centrist candidates. And like you said, centrist doesn't mean you're a fence sitter. You don't have to automatically by default, if you're a center-left candidate, agree with everything that the left is doing. A centrist means JFK, John F. Kennedy he was a radical centrist, and he defined his ideology as idealism without illusions. And he initiated the process of enacting the Civil Rights Bill in the United States, which was the most important social legislation, perhaps from the days of Abraham Lincoln. And of course, it happened after he died by his successor, Lyndon Johnson. So he was anything but a fence sitter. Today, Emmanuel Macron is certainly a centrist candidate, and a centrist politician. And he, in some ways, by recently upholding France's faith and belief in civil liberties and in a free, open, liberal society, what he's done politically is he's also essentially pushed the far right in France, Le Pen and others, to the corner. He's in a sense, as I said, by becoming a 12 o'clock candidate, he's reached out even to the 1 and 2 o'clock voters, as well as to the 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock voters. So he's broadened his base to such an extent that now his base is from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. So it's a very smart political strategy. And so it's good politics. It's not fence-sitting politics. It's actually the right kind of politics. Because eventually, politics, I believe, in countries as diverse as America, Europe, and India, it's like a tennis match. When you watch somebody playing tennis, they go and take their shot right by the net, or they go to the side. But after they've hit the ball, they go back to the center, because that gives them the ability to then move to the left, to the right, to maneuver. And when I say to maneuver can be seen as a very bad word. But I think it's an important area to be in, because you can't have divisions all the time. You can't, and there are good ideas on the left. There are very good ideas on the right also. And every politician, Dr. Manmohan Singh, for instance, was a center-left candidate in a center-left party, but had some ideas which you could argue were borrowed from the right. I think Narendra Modi is a center-right candidate or a prime minister, but is certainly borrowing a lot of ideas from the left. Economically, you can argue which are one can argue, and his critics would say are far left ideas.
Yes, he's taking a lot of page from welfare economics.
So I don't think that it's it's unfair to call somebody. I think Donald Trump, for instance, he was certainly a right, a leader on the right, but some of his economic ideas, like a trade war, it's a classical communist left-wing idea, and he did his trade policies were more left-wing than any Democrat before him. So I think the politicians of the future, it's you can't bracket a politician as being only right or only left. They may be socially right, they may be economically left, they may be economically right, they may be socially left. They may be occasionally socially right and occasionally socially left on some issues. So on some economic issues, they could be left, they could be right. So those days are gone, to just pigeonhole people into that. And I think voters also need a new narrative and a new vocabulary when describing politicians. And for a country, the reason I argued it is for a country to heal wounds, to unite people. There's a very famous quote again by an American politician, Jesse Jackson, who was a civil rights leader. And he said, leadership is not just about choosing sides, it's about bringing sides together. And that's my response to people who accuse centrist politics of being fence-setting politics, is that it's very easy to just say, I'm a leftist all the way, I'm a right-wing all the way, and I do right-wing politics blindly, or I do left-wing politics blindly. But the really smart people are the ones who are not insecure to say that I think there are good ideas across the aisle. And it's important to reach out and work with people across the aisle. And Priya, mind you, that's how democratic institutions in India and the United States were designed. They were not designed for these hardened stances where the left and right never meet and it's either 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock. They were designed for 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock, where you're able to reach out, cut across the aisle, get work done. And I really believe, if you look at it in terms of data, the politicians who have got the most done from an economic agenda, a developmental agenda, a social agenda, a foreign policy agenda, are typically centrist politicians. The rest are typically people who talk a lot, they're full of rhetoric, but don't get things done, and for no fault of theirs essentially, but because of their politics, because their politics does not allow them to get those things done.
Okay, thanks, Milind. Thank you so much. We're totally out of time. In fact, at least you define the happy hour for politicians, I would say. That is between 11 o'clock to what? You got me a lot.
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock. Okay.
That's right.
On that, and for a politician to succeed, just keep everybody along. I think that is the answer, perhaps to what is happening in India also. But thanks so much for this conversation, Milind. Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.